20 stories above the ground on the south side of the Washington National Cathedral, a stone pinnacle carved by hand more than 80 years earlier began to twist. An invisible hand seemed to reach down and rotate it clockwise, wrenching its columns out of true, and when the shaking stopped, the pinnacle stayed standing. But it never stayed straight again. Engineers would spend 6 years watching it lean before they finally admitted it could not be saved and lowered it to the ground in 93 separate pieces. A few miles away, at the top of the tallest stone structure on Earth, a crack 4 feet long and an inch wide opened across one face of the small pyramid that caps the Washington Monument, and more than 150 smaller cracks appeared beneath it, all the way down through masonry that had stood since before the Civil War ended. This did not happen in California. It happened in Virginia on a Tuesday afternoon in August, and by the time the shaking reached Washington, it had already been felt in a dozen states most Americans would never think to associate with an earthquake at all. No lava, no fault line with a famous name, no warning of any kind. Just an ordinary weekday, and then a tower built to stand for 1,000 years quietly cracking near its own summit. This is the story of the earthquake the East Coast was not supposed to have, and the reason a monument and a cathedral built to outlast centuries were nearly undone by a fault line nobody can even name. The date was the 23rd of August, 2011, just before 2 in the afternoon. Deep beneath the small town of Mineral, Virginia, about 40 miles northwest of Richmond, the ground slipped along a fracture buried in ancient rock and released a magnitude 5.8 earthquake. For the people standing in Mineral, that was already a serious shake. Furniture toppled, a school evacuated, a nuclear power plant briefly shut itself down as a precaution. But the story of this earthquake was never really about Mineral. It was about how far the shaking traveled after it left. The United States Geological Survey has since called it the most widely felt earthquake in American history. Not the strongest, not the deadliest, but the one that reached the most people at once. It was felt in Georgia. It was felt in Maine. Reports came in from Florida and from parts of Canada. When USGS opened its "Did You Feel It?" survey afterward, more than 148,000 people responded from over 3,400 separate zip codes, and independent estimates put the true number of people who felt it at somewhere close to 1/3 of the entire population of the United States. Sit with that for a second. One earthquake felt by something like 100 million people, most of whom had never once considered that the ground under a Washington row house or a Philadelphia brownstone could move. Which brings us back to that pinnacle and that crack in the monument, because the damage in the nation's capital tells you something the felt reports alone cannot. The Washington Monument sits on the National Mall, 555 feet of white marble, the tallest structure in the city by law and by design. When the shaking arrived from Mineral, the very top of that obelisk, the narrow pyramid called the pyramidion, swayed hardest of all, the way the tip of a whip snaps harder than the handle. That is where the 4-foot crack opened. That is where inspectors, lowered down the outside on ropes in the following weeks, found spalled stone and fractures they had never had reason to look for before. The final repair bill came to $15 million, and the monument stayed closed to the public for nearly 3 years. Not reopening until May of 2014, the National Cathedral fared worse. Its damage bill ran to $38 million, the highest of any single structure in the region, and more than a decade later, contractors were still working through the list. Gargoyles cracked, buttresses shifted, and that one pinnacle, twisted clockwise by forces nobody inside the building ever felt as anything more dramatic than a strong shake, had to be dismantled stone by stone because engineers could no longer trust it to hold itself up in the next one. Picture that for a moment, a piece of architecture that survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and nearly a century of Washington summers, undone not by neglect or age on its own, but by roughly 30 seconds of shaking on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. And here is the detail that almost nobody outside the repair crews ever learned. The Washington Monument closed a second time years later, in 2016, for an entirely unrelated elevator and security upgrade that kept it shut until 2019. It is easy to conflate the 2 closures into one long saga and assume the monument spent the better part of a decade broken from a single earthquake. It did not. The earthquake closure alone ran nearly 3 years, ending in 2014, fully paid for and fully repaired before that second unrelated closure ever began. Worth being precise about because the earthquake damage was serious enough on its own without needing to borrow years from an unrelated construction project. Here is the rest hook worth sitting with for a moment because it is the whole reason this story matters more than a single afternoon in 2011. There will be a next one. Not tomorrow, not on a predictable schedule. But the fault system that produced mineral is still there, still capable, and still barely understood. And in a minute, I am going to show you why. An earthquake barely stronger than the one that just rattled your coffee cup in Virginia can knock stone off a cathedral roof in Washington, while an earthquake in California that size barely makes the evening news. To understand that, you have to stop thinking about earthquakes as one single kind of event, because East Coast earthquakes and West Coast earthquakes are not really the same phenomenon wearing different addresses. They behave differently in the ground itself. Here's the mechanism, and it is the single most important idea in this entire video. The crust beneath the eastern United States is old, geologically ancient, cold and dense, shaped and compressed over hundreds of millions of years since long before the Atlantic Ocean even existed in its current form. The crust beneath California, by contrast, is young, warm, and riddled with active fractures, the San Andreas system chief among them. When an earthquake fires energy into young, fractured western rock, that energy scatters and absorbs quickly, the way a punch lands differently on a body covered in bruises than on solid muscle. But when an earthquake fires energy into old, cold, dense eastern rock, the seismic waves travel through it almost efficiently, losing very little strength as they go, because the rock has had all that time to heal its old fractures into something closer to solid stone. The comparison scientists themselves reach for is almost too clean to be real. The magnitude 5.8 quake that cracked the Washington Monument was felt as far as 600 miles from where it started. 3 years later, a magnitude 6.0 earthquake struck Napa, California, a full notch stronger on a scale where each notch means roughly 30 times more energy released, and it was felt only about 250 miles out. A weaker earthquake in Virginia outran a stronger earthquake in California by more than double the distance, purely because of what kind of rock the shaking had to travel through. That is not folklore. That is measured, published, repeated science, and it is the reason a moderate earthquake near a small Virginia town could still be doing structural damage in a city 100 miles away. Think about what that actually means for a region that has spent generations assuming distance was a form of safety. On the West Coast, being 70 or 80 miles from a fault line buys you real protection because the young, broken rock in between soaks up the worst of the energy before it ever reaches you. On the East Coast, that same 70 or 80 miles barely slows anything down. The old dense rock underneath Washington, Philadelphia, and New York acts less like a shock absorber and more like a drum skin, carrying the vibration efficiently in every direction, which is exactly why a monument on the National Mall, 40 miles from the epicenter in Mineral, ended up with cracks near its summit at all. Now here is the part of this story that should genuinely unsettle you, and it is the part the news coverage from 2011 mostly skipped past. Nobody can point to the fault. Not with confidence. The zone responsible for the Mineral earthquake is called the Central Virginia Seismic Zone, a stretch of the Piedmont roughly 13,000 square kilometers wide, wrapping around Richmond and Charlottesville, and inside that zone, seismologists have never confidently tied the region's earthquakes to a single, mapped, named fault the way they can for the San Andreas or the Hayward Fault out west. Most Virginia earthquakes simply cannot be traced to any surface fault at all. The leading explanation ties the zone to ancient rift structures left behind from when the continents pulled apart and the Atlantic Ocean was born, deep scars in the crust that occasionally, unpredictably, let go. Seismometers have been listening to this ground continuously since the 1960s, run jointly by Virginia Tech and the federal government, and they still record small, mostly harmless earthquakes in the region roughly every year or two. The zone is being watched every single day by instruments built specifically because scientists know it is capable of producing exactly what it produced in 2011. They simply cannot tell you when it will happen again, or exactly which patch of buried rock will be responsible. And this is not a 2011 story that quietly ended. In April of 2024, a magnitude 4.8 earthquake struck near Lebanon, New Jersey, barely 45 miles from Times Square. It was the strongest earthquake recorded in New Jersey since 1783, and the strongest shaking felt in New York City since an earthquake back in 1884, more than a century earlier. Estimates put the number of people who felt it at over 42 million, spread across 14 states from Maine down to North Carolina. More than 30 aftershocks followed in the weeks after. Almost no one outside the immediate area realized in the moment that they were living through a genuine reminder that this entire stretch of the country, from Virginia up through the boroughs of New York, sits on ground that periodically, quietly, proves it is not done shaking. So, why does this keep catching people off guard? Because of a false belief that is honestly reasonable to hold if you grew up anywhere east of the Rockies. Earthquakes feel like a California problem. They are what happens to other people, in a state everybody already associates with fault lines and evacuation drills. Nobody grows up in Maryland or Ohio or Massachusetts being taught to expect the ground to move, and that belief shapes something far more consequential than what people expect on a Tuesday afternoon. It shapes what gets built. Here is where I want to correct something that gets repeated online constantly because it is not quite true, and this channel does not deal in exaggeration when the honest version of the story is dramatic enough on its own. It is not accurate to say the East Coast has no seismic building code at all. Modern codes actually do assign every location in the country, including Virginia and New Jersey and the District of Columbia, a specific seismic design category based on real hazard data, and newer construction in this region is built with at least some of that risk in mind. What is true, and what actually matters, is the enormous stock of older buildings that were finished decades or even a century before any of those modern codes existed. Brick buildings across the region, the kind that make up entire historic downtown blocks from Richmond to Philadelphia to Boston, are what engineers classify as unreinforced masonry. Walls and decorative stonework never tied into the floors and roof, the way a modern structure requires, brittle rather than flexible, built to hold up their own weight and nothing more. When ground shaking arrives, that kind of building does not bend. It cracks, the way the cathedral's pinnacle cracked, the way parapets and cornices come loose and fall. The gap is not an absence of any rule on paper. The gap is a landscape full of buildings that were finished long before the rule existed, and were never required to go back and meet it. And mineral was not even close to the worst this coast has produced. Long before anyone owned a car, on a warm night at the end of August in 1886, the city of Charleston, South Carolina, was hit by an earthquake estimated at roughly magnitude 7, more than a full point stronger than mineral, and on the logarithmic scale seismologists use, that difference is not small. It is closer to 30 times more energy released. About 60 people died. Roughly 2,000 buildings were damaged badly enough to matter at a cost that ran into the millions of dollars in 1886 money. Structural damage was documented hundreds of miles away, as far south as the Georgia coast. It remains to this day the most damaging earthquake ever recorded in the southeastern United States, and it happened on the same general stretch of ancient, efficient eastern crust that carried the shaking out of mineral more than a century later. Charleston is not a warning about tomorrow. It is proof that this coast has already produced something far worse than a cracked monument within recorded American history, not in some distant geologic past. Let's talk honestly about odds, because that is the responsible way to end a story like this, rather than the sensational one. The Central Virginia seismic zone, and the wider Piedmont region around it, produces small, largely harmless earthquakes on a fairly regular basis. Something felt, but rarely damaging, roughly every year or two. A damaging event on the scale of mineral in 2011 is genuinely rare. The region had gone many decades without one before that afternoon, and nothing in current monitoring data points toward another one arriving on any predictable timeline. Federal hazard maps do treat the eastern seaboard as a real, if comparatively low probability, seismic zone, not a zero-risk one, and infrequent large earthquakes are geologically possible here, the way 2011 and centuries of scattered historical accounts already prove. But scientists cannot tell you when the next one comes, only that the ground has done this before, and the instruments listening to it have no reason to expect it has stopped. So, 3 futures. In the most likely one, the Central Virginia seismic zone keeps doing exactly what it has done for decades. Small quakes every year or two, felt by a few, damaging to no one, while seismometers keep quietly logging every tremor the way they have since the 1960s. In the realistic middle future, something in the range of the 2011 or 2024 events happens again, sometime in the coming years, rattling a wide swath of the East Coast, cracking a few more old buildings, and reminding tens of millions of people for a week or two that the ground under them is not as settled as they assumed before the story fades from the news again. And in the honest worst case, something closer to Charleston in 1886 happens again. A rare, much larger event, striking this same old, efficient rock at a moment when it is closer to a dense modern population center than Mineral ever was. And the real cost lands not on national monuments with government budgets and engineering firms on standby, but on the ordinary unreinforced brick buildings that make up so much of the historic East Coast. Structures with no $15 million repair fund waiting in the wings, and no crew ready to lower their stones to the ground before they fall on their own. Here is my honest opinion. After everything the research shows, the East Coast does not have an earthquake problem the way California does, and it would be dishonest of me to tell you otherwise. California lives with this risk every single day, has built an entire culture and a strict set of laws around it, and still faces a larger, more frequent hazard than anything sitting under Richmond or New Jersey. I am not telling you to move or to bolt your bookshelves to the wall tonight, but the East Coast has an earthquake blind spot, and that is arguably more dangerous than a well-known risk, because a blind spot does not get funded, does not get retrofitted, and does not get talked about in a city council meeting until a crack opens in a national monument on live television. The ground beneath Washington and New York and Richmond is not inert. It is old. It is efficient at carrying shockwaves farther than almost anywhere else in the country. And it has already proven twice in the last 15 years, once in Virginia and once in New Jersey, that it is willing to remind an entire region of that fact with almost no warning at all. Charleston in 1886 proves it can go much further than a crack in some stonework. My honest opinion is that a coast which has spent a century and a half treating that as ancient history is overdue to treat it as a standing fact about the ground it is built on instead. I want to ask you something, and I would genuinely like to know the answer in the comments. Do you remember exactly where you were on the day of the 2011 earthquake, if you felt it? Not what you read about it afterward, but the actual moment, whatever room you were standing in when the ground did something it was never supposed to do. I have heard from viewers who assumed it was a truck outside, or a washing machine off balance, or their own dizziness, before anyone said the word earthquake out loud, and some who confessed they genuinely did not believe it until the news confirmed it that evening, because the idea felt too impossible to accept in the moment. If you were somewhere on that coast that Tuesday afternoon, in Virginia or Washington, or as far out as Ohio or New York, tell me your version below, and be honest about the very first explanation your brain reached for before it landed on the right one. If this is the first time you have really understood why an earthquake on one coast behaves so differently from an earthquake on the other, that is exactly what this channel exists to do. So take a second and hit like before you go. It genuinely helps more people find this. And subscribe, because the next story on this channel stays in exactly this territory, an old American river town where the ground did something so strange in the winter of 1811 that it reportedly made a great river run backward for a moment, rang church bells hundreds of miles away, and left behind a seismic zone that some scientists consider more dangerous, long-term, than anything sitting under Los Angeles. You will want to see what that town looked like the morning after. The ground beneath America is speaking. Make sure you are listening.